Hello, this is Pat Tucci talking to you about John Young, supposedly the founding father of the Youngstown area. He arrived in the Mahoning Red River Valley on June 27, 1796, in known areas today as Spring Commons, also could be known as Western Reserve Road. Supposedly, the Connecticut Land Company had him buy 15,560 acres from the Western Reserve Company of Connecticut in 1797, establishing John Young's town. I don't know if I believe all that. All I know is that John Young was an ambitious man who owned a saloon and a trading post there, and also owned a whorehouse right next to it and made a lot of money. If you want to believe that he was the founding father of Youngstown, well, that's just up to you. However, it is not up to me. That's all I have to say about John Young. We're going to talk about Caleb Baldwin Wick, who was born in 1795 and died in 1865, who married Marie Andelia Griffith. They had 8 children: Rachel, Hannah, Laura, Caleb Baldwin Wick Jr., Henry Kirkland Wick, Charles E. Wick, Eliza M. Wick, and Mary M. Wick. He had brothers and sisters: Caleb Baldwin Wick again, Thomas Wick, Betsy Wick, Lemuel Wick, Henry Wick, Hugh Bryson Wick, Hannah Wick, Matilda Lucretia Wick, John Dennick Wick, Mary Ann Wick, Thomas Lupka Wick, Paul Wick. We can go on forever with this. A lot of these Wicks, if you go to Oak Hill Cemetery, you'll find that these were small children that maybe lived 6 months or a year. It's a horrible thing, but it is said that the Stambaugh and the Wicks were cursed. Along with these curses was the death of Henry H. Stambaugh, January 4th, 1919, supposedly found dead in a hotel room in New Orleans. He also was big into donating things to the city and to the Youngstown area, like the Henry Stambaugh Golf Course, which was the family farm. And then there was the Stambaugh Auditorium that he bequeathed the funds for that through his brother John Stambaugh. It just goes on and on. They say the ghost of Henry Stambaugh still walks through Stambaugh Auditorium. Case in point about Colonel Caleb B. Wick, which is the same as Caleb B. Wick, even though there's like 3 or 4 Wicks of the same name. Caleb actually became one of the first operators and owners of the Bank of Sharon, Pennsylvania. Isn't that interesting? After that interest, they started building railroads, which became a very important situation with the other brothers who started it. Like his father, Henry Wick, was involved with that too, not to be confused with the other Henry Wicks. He was the first president of the Youngstown and Sharon Steel Railroad Company for half a century. He purchased property in and around Youngstown, Ohio. If you go up and down Fifth Avenue and around the Wick Park, funny, has the same name, a lot of these Wicks lived there. If you go past by the university, there was a street called Wick Oval. Unfortunately, they tore down this beautiful historical site where all the Wicks used to live. In fact, there's houses there now on Fifth Avenue and on Park Avenue and Broadway and Elm where the Wicks used to live. The Wicks left a footprint everywhere they went, and they were major players in the development of the area. And I'm not saying that it was all wonderful. I'm just saying they had a big part of it. In fact, Henry Wick was the president of the Witch Hazel Coal Company. Unbelievable. And they also contributed to many other businesses. Henry K. Wick, who was president of a big coal firm in Youngstown, began one of 10 born to Caleb B. Wick and Maria Aldelia. I mean, these Wicks were into everything. they were also into each other. A lot of them married cousins and relatives. I mean, it's just preposterous. But they wanted to keep the money in the same area. Henry Wick, would that be Henry Bryson Wick, uh, did some crazy things. He was very ambitious. He had a crazy mind, too. He was the son of Henry and Hannah Baldwin Wick. Henry became involved with steel, iron and steel. He began a remarkable business career as a merchant and then later in Brookfield in Trumbull County. And he began to do other business ventures. And they all got together. Caleb, Paul, Henry, Dr. Henry Manning, William Rice, and others. They all got together and did a rolling mill enterprise, which was actually the nucleus of the developing steel mills. And they call it, out of Cleveland, they had a place. It was called the Shenango Allegheny Railroad Company, and also the Wick brothers, rolling steel, and bankers. They also had banks too. I'm not going to get into all what they had, but they had John C. Wick was the vice president, and you'll remember, of the Dollar Savings and Trust Company, the original bank. It is just unbelievable. And John C. Wick, he was into banks. He was into steel producing. Him, Nelson Crandall, and William B. Pollock, and a bunch of others came together and created these giant corporations that would take over failing steel plants and just bum rushed a whole bunch of them. They also controlled banks. They were very big into banks, and what they can do with these banks is they can loan themselves money and make a bunch of money. So what I'm trying to say is the Wicks were into everything. A lot of them married into the Arms family. They married into the Pollocks. They married into the Stambaugh. Everybody was intermingled into the rich. And they also started a place around Crandall Park called the North Heights Land Company. And they built Crandall Park along Nelson Crandall, David and George Todd. And of course, David Todd became governor of Ohio in the early 18th century, somewhere in the 18th century. I don't have it right in front of me now. And had his son George bequeath and bestow the farm, the Todd Homestead Farm, which is right on Belmont Avenue, to the city and other entities to form the Todd Homestead Cemetery. If you walk around there, there's only a few Todds buried there. All the other Todds had to be buried in the Garden Cemetery at Oak Hill Cemetery, which is on the south side on Oak Hill. You'll see that the Oak Hill Cemetery, which I think is the most haunted cemetery in the area, is full of Wicks, the Pollocks, the Stambaughs. Anybody you can think of is there that is important. But most of all, Caleb lived a long life, died around, I don't know, I think he was around 70 years old, something like that. And he lived a long life. He did a lot of accomplishments. He was a colonel. And of course, the stone is there at Oak Hill Cemetery of George Wick, who was on the Titanic with his wife and several cousins. And he gave up his seat to them on one of the lifeboats so that they can make it. Unfortunately, he didn't make it. And there's a stone in postulance of him being there and his recognition for doing the right thing at the right time. So hooray for George Wick. Definitely a man of integrity. The last intense moments aboard the Titanic were very scary for the Wicks and Carolyn Bonnell, which is a cousin-in-law. They were rushed from slumber to the lifeboats. They all boarded, and George sat down, but there was no room for Caroline Bonnell. George got up and had her sit down and said he would catch the next one. This is how it all began. The beginning of the end for George D. Wick. So the women were on the boat. We have George Dennick Wick's wife, Mary, and their stepdaughter, Mary Wick, who were on the boat, the lifeboat. They just enjoyed a beautiful vacation in Europe. George wasn't feeling well, so he thought perhaps a vacation in Europe will put him in a better frame of health, so he wouldn't have to retire. Carolyn and Natalie were also cousins, and Carolyn Bonnell was with them too. So all the Wicks made it on the boat. The cousins, Natalie, they made it to the boat. And then, of course, Elizabeth Bonnell made it to the boat too, which is also another cousin-in-law. George gave up his seat to Caroline, and they started lowering the boat down into the water. When they reached the water, they found it to be very cold out. The wind was cold. It was like ice, especially for the women. They were poorly dressed. Miss Bonnell took to an oar to help keep warm. She observed everything that was going on. She was only 30 years old. She began to talk.
The Titanic was fading in the distance, but her lights were quite visible. About 20 minutes after we were put in the boat, we noticed that the giant ship was sinking low in the water. Then we realized for the first time that it was in danger, and our luck turned into a frightened party of women. Lower and lower sank the Titanic. The faint strains of a band came to us. Then all of a sudden the lower lights seemed to go out. Only the lights on the upper deck were visible. And then we saw the ship sink, this great unsinkable liner. It didn't plunge as far as we could see, but seemed to settle lower and lower into the water and went down gently, grandly, to its grave. Then the full horror of the thing came over us. We were frightened, but the men in the boat tried to reassure us. They told us that those left behind on the boat would surely leave it, that they would be picked up in a short time.
Let's talk about the Stambaugh. John Stambaugh, preferably, who married Sarah Beaver. John was born June 7th, 1795, and passed away on May 10th, 1870. His bride and wife, Sarah Beaver, was born 1797 and passed away July 9th, 1861, 9 years prior to John's death. John had relations. He was the brother of William Stambaugh, Samuel Stambaugh, Mary Stambaugh Schilling, Martin Stambaugh, Juliana Stambaugh, Sarah Stambaugh, Crandall Arabella Stambaugh, Ford Jacob Stambaugh, Daniel Beaver Stambaugh, Margaret Elizabeth Stambaugh, and David Lupper Stambaugh, husband of Caroline Hamilton Stambaugh, and father Henry Hamilton Stambaugh and John Stambaugh Jr. Now, I can go back a lot farther and so on and so forth, but I'm not going to because it can go on forever. The Stambaughs here presently, in which I wish to convey to you, was part of a curse that was going on and around the Wicks and the Stambaughs. If you talk to any of the Stambaughs or Wicks that are still alive, they know of this curse. Captain Daniel B. Stambaugh was actually the son of one of the other Stambaughs, supposedly Henry, but there is no record of Henry having any children. Henry was the one who donated the money to Stambaugh Auditorium. As it turns out, it was his uncle, Captain Daniel Beaver Stambaugh, and Daniel was the younger brother, Daniel Stambaugh, and Henry's father. John and Sarah Beaver, hence the middle name, they grew up in Briar Hill, and the family became involved in the coal and iron interests of his father and brother John and nephew Henry. They eventually had investments in iron mines in Idaho and Colorado, which was bringing them great wealth, and that's where it came from. In 1861, they needed people for the Union Army. It was a good thing for the Stambaughs because they were able to, as they say in the back in the day of the Wicks and the Stambaughs, is make book with Governor Todd. David Todd, to be exact. David Todd became a very influential person because he was governor of Ohio for only 2 years, because he couldn't make it to the next election because he lost his support. So the bottom line is that the Stambaughs got involved with coal and steel and other things, mostly pig iron, and they also originally started making charcoal for the steel industry, but the reality was they went from charcoal to coke. Coke is coal that is cooked at 2,500 degrees for 24 to 48 hours, and then becomes coke. And then it burns very hot and is able to melt steel. So what happens now, the Thompsons and the Stambaughs put together a hardware company when they started working as merchants in the Ohio Valley. And as they made their money as merchants, they invested in these hardware stores where people were building houses and building buildings, and they carried everything you needed to build a giant building to a little garage or something like that. The Stambaughs were very witty people. They were very smart. They had a good sense of everything. The Stambaughs, of course, they're all buried at Oak Hill Cemetery too. That's if you were anybody in Youngstown, and I say this over and over again, that you were buried at Oak Hill Cemetery. Even the Todds, Governor Todd, David Todd, and his son George, they're buried at Oak Hill, even though they bequeathed the farm as a cemetery on Belmont Avenue, Todd Homestead Cemetery. It's crazy things. Just a rough idea how much the Stambaughs were making in money-wise. The first hospital was started with a contribution of 2 1/2 acres of land across from where Oak Hill Cemetery is, and $10,000 by John Stambaugh. It also was the big start of the Southside unit of the Youngstown Hospital Association, and it's the same location on Oak Street, where they also donated land for St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where it had its beginnings when 2 houses on Belmont Avenue were joined, and the first patient was admitted on December 8, 1911. However, they did not have much to do with Northside Hospital, which I have a video out of Haunted Northside Hospital. It was all started with the Youngstown Hospital Association, including the one on South Avenue, which opened prior to the one on the Northside Hospital, which opened in roughly around 1923 to 29, somewhere in that area. The turn of the century brought the automobile industry into the town. You had the Manchester brothers, who brought a Cadillac dealership into Youngstown. This is in the early 1900s, somewhere in that and about. They came down from Cleveland. I believe it was C.C. Manchester and R.A. Manchester. I believe they're buried at Todd Homestead, but they're originally from Cleveland. And they drove, of course, they come down in these brand new fancy Cadillacs, which was like, yeah. In 1904, the Stambaugh and Henry Wick also had a $20,000 Blue Goose, a six-passenger custom-built automobile. Uh, it was built in Fredonia, but it was the first that could travel 36 miles in 35 minutes. The prosperity spread all over through the valley here. Uh, John Stambaugh and a couple other Stambaughs, after John passed away in 1870, of course, there was other Stambaughs that were involved with Stambaugh uh, Thompsons. And this was an interesting thing because I started talking about it. And the reality is, uh, his boss, he became a partner with Thompson, but he was like a junior partner. And that's what was the prerequisite of the beginning of Stambaugh Thompsons. And then when Thompson passed away later on, uh, Stambaugh, which was John II, became the sole owner of Stambaugh Thompsons. It actually was a great thing. There's some ambiguity here about, is it Stambaugh Thompson the second or the third? Through my research, I do not really know how this came about. I do know that the Stambaughs were a big part of Stambaugh Thompsons. They were a big part of the iron and steel business, and their names are riddled all over Youngstown, just like the Wicks, the Beechers, the Pollocks. In fact, they even had a thing going with William B. Pollock, which created the first railroad cars where you could actually transport steaming, readily hot coke and coal and other products to make steel. It's a very interesting situation. Let us talk about Joseph G. Butler Jr. was an American industrialist remembered primarily for establishing, the American Museum of American Art in Youngstown. He was born in December 1840 in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. His family owned, operated blast furnaces in Pennsylvania and relocated to Niles when he was a child. It all started with his father, but once it gets in your blood of making that big money, he couldn't let it go. Of course, one of his classmates was William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, who was assassinated in 1901. Butler was instrumental in bringing the McKinley Birthplace Memorial to Niles. Butler became involved with the iron industry in his 30s. In 1892, he and a local industrialist, Henry Wick, organized the Ohio Steel Company, which built two Bessemer plants along the Mahoning River just north of Youngstown. 4 years later, the company was sold to Pittsburgh-based National Steel Company. These two had a reputation of starting businesses and selling them at a high profit. The local plant became part of the Carnegie Steel Company, which in 1901 was sold to J.P. Morgan to form the U.S. Steel Corporation. This is just how the greed in these people worked. Butler was nationally known and served as the director of a number of corporations as well as the director of the American Iron and Steel Institute. In 1919, Butler founded the Butler Institute of American Art in Youngstown near the campus of Youngstown State University. This was the first museum dedicated to strictly American artwork. Butler left most of his $1.5 billion estate to the Institute. Butler wanted the museum to be free to the public and continues to be, charging no admission. Yes, Joseph G. Butler Jr. was an American industrialist. If it wasn't for his wonderful wife that nobody seems to want to talk about, none of this money would have been donated to Youngstown, or there would be no art museum. Remember that. This is factual. Here is a strange twist about Joseph G. Butler Jr. He was buried at Belmont Park Cemetery. You will see the plot. It will come up shortly here, as you will see the plot. His whole family is buried there. The mystery of it all is, why wasn't he buried at Oak Hill Cemetery? I guess it's going to remain a mystery. Let us talk about Ward Beecher, who ended up being the vice president of commercial shearing and stamping. But not only that, he was an auditor for the Republic Rubber Company, which we will get to later on. But first things first, Henry Ward Beecher, his father, a minister, was accused of having an affair with a congregation woman who was married. The woman's name was Elizabeth Tilton. It was a very horrible thing, because the New York clergyman was charged with adultery. Beecher had conducted an affair with Elizabeth Tilton, wife of Theodore Tilton. Both Tiltons were members of the Beecher's Plymouth Church, and Tilton was editor of the journal, the Independent Journal, which Beecher had formerly edited. Into giving into her husband's suspicions, Elizabeth admitted to the adulterous affair. I'm not going to get into it anymore, but he tried to get her to back out of it by lying. And we'll just stop right there. Now let's get back to Ward Beecher, who was born September 27, 1887, and graduated from Lorraine High School. He went to study metallurgy at Carnegie Institute of Technology, followed by war service of 309 engineers in France in World War I. He returned to Youngstown in 1923 and married Florence Simon. Nothing big here. Just typical growth spurts. He worked for a time as the auditor of the Republic Rubber Company, and we'll get back to that later, because there is a lot of that. And the treasurer of Powell Press Still. From 1922, he occupied a number of positions at Commercial Shearing and Stamping Company, and ended up as vice president of finance. He also followed his father's footsteps, serving as the director of the Mahoning Bank. He attended a director's meeting on the day of his death, and bada boom, that's it. But where did Ward Beecher get all this money? That is the question. Where did he get all this money, and how did he make all this money? Serving as a director of the Mahoning Bank, he could give loans to his billion-dollar friends. He can give loans to people that could influence him. He can give loans to people, and I'm not saying that this has happened, but the amount of wealth this man has accrued is unbelievable, especially the way he donated it back to the YSU and the city. He gave loans out to what I will call the Rat Pack of the Youngstown area. The Youngstown area Rat Pack, and that will come up later in this video. So again, where did Ward Beecher get all this money? Like many other business leaders of his generation, he served as a leader and benefactor of a number of Youngstown organizations, from the Salvation Army to boys clubs, as well as the Youngstown Club, the Youngstown Country Club, the Elks, and other organizations. In the late 1950s, the Beechers sold their priced homestead where they were living to the Franciscan Friary. Later on, they made substantial contributions for improvements. Later on, they moved to Boardman. But with the positions he had, where did Ward Beecher get all this money? It was simple. When you're on a director of a major bank, you can give loans to your friends who own other corporations to buy other corporations to get richer. He got kickbacks, is my only guess, and I say it is my opinion, where he acquired his wealth, because some of the positions he's had, including the ones at Republic Rubber and Commercial Shearing, can only pay so much. But Ward Beecher and all was a good person. He donated tons of money to YSU, including money for the planetarium that's been upgraded several times, with only one stipulation. And that stipulation is plain as day, that everyone, and I mean everyone, be admitted free into the planetarium. So there you have it, Ward Beecher. Now let's talk about the money magnates, the Rat Pack of Youngstown, Ohio. Well, let's just say Ohio or northeastern United States. Some of these money-making machines was H.K. Wick, A.E. Adams, John Todd, Governor David Todd. A lot of these people were part of the Youngstown Rat Pack that I call. And that doesn't even exclude Nelson Crandall, who was the money magnate man of Governor David Todd. A.E. Adams, John Todd, Scott Bunnell, C.H. Booth, H.M. Robinson, George Todd, John C. Wick. These men were all big money people. It all started with Colonel George Dennick Wick, who drowned on the Titanic. Let us go on about these people and their goings on with Republic Rubber that is still staying there because nobody will take ownership of it because the building was sold to people out of town. Here's how it all started. Republic Rubber was chartered on February 28, 1901 with a capital of $400,000. Its officials included, of course, H.K. Wick as president, A.F. Adams as vice president, John Todd as secretary and treasurer, with A.E. Adams, W. Scott Bunnell, C.H. Booth, H.M. Robinson, George Todd, H.K. Wick, John C. Wick serving as directors, and of course, Nelson Crandall, the Manchester brothers, and several others all had their fingers in the till. It located its factory to produce pneumatic and solid automobile tires, rubber hoses, and belts on the site of the American Belting Company in 1902, which we know today as Elbert Street. The company continued to expand until it held a capital of $10 million. A new building to manufacture solid rubber was erected in 1907, followed by a storage building in 1908. An office building was completed in 1910 with a clubhouse for the employees, added in 1913. Well, this was a money-making machine. Not only were they doing great with making rubber hoses and tubes and tires and so on, they were using real rubber. And then when synthetic rubber came onto the market, they bought that. But there was one big mistake. Very big mistake. Today it's been corrected. But back then, if you mix synthetic rubber with real rubber in a warming press, it puts out toxic fumes. But the toxic fumes don't do anything right away. They just smell funny. There's many people that work there. At one time, there was a payroll of $10 million a year, 2,500 employees. The site is still standing there. All I could say is these men are responsible for the would-be death of over 500 employees there who died of cancers that nobody has ever seen or heard of. It was terrible. They never cared because they deserted the company, because they sold it in 1978, what was left of it and what was left with them, as an Aero-equipped Youngstown plant. It was closing due to nearly, the competition from overseas. But several other companies bought it. I'm not going to get into them. The city of Youngstown bought part of it and donated some of the land to the employees so it could become an employee-owned company. But the reality is it went belly up, and it sits there. And it won't be torn down because there's so many PCBs there and so many chemical agents and all these labyrinth of tunnels underneath there. I've been there. I made a special on it. This place is extremely dangerous. Don't go there. Not only is it dangerous and there's chemicals around, there's a number of spirits there that just will chase you out of there, or they will sucker you into coming down into the tunnels. They played a significant role. The Wick family played a big role, a significant role of this rat pack of magnates, starting with George Dennick Wick being the founding president of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, and other family members involved in related businesses like the Mahoning Valley Iron Company and the Girard Rolling Mill. It just goes everywhere. The Wicks organized and ran the Youngstown Rolling Mill Company. An early successor company was their iron business. They then joined forces to incorporate the Ohio Iron and Steel Company, serving as its vice president for many years. All these people that were organized for this was the president of Youngstown Commercial Shearing. All these people had a big part in one way or another with Republic Rubber. They also used the Wick building that was designed by the older Wick. I think it was Caleb Wick, and then John Wick took over, and they added 4 or 5 more floors to it. It was a 13-story, 184-foot tall building. It was built between 1906 and 1910 of steel from the Cambria Steel Company of Johnson, Pennsylvania, which they owned, faced with red brick and decorated with terracotta. The design complemented the earlier federal building across Phelps Street. Financing was derived from Youngstown native George Dennick Wick, a leading iron and steel manufacturer whose family was involved in banking and real estate. Again, nothing like owning a bank or 2 or 3 or 10 to loan yourself money. It was ready for occupancy in 1910. It was the city's tallest building until the completion of the Metropolitan Tower in 1929. The building was home of the Wick Brothers Trust Company and other Wick family enterprises, including George Todd's family and their enterprises, and all the fingers that Governor David Todd had his fingers in. Big companies. The money man who handled all the conniving deals was Nelson Crandall, who was married to Sarah Stambaugh. Now, I say it that way because I've experienced this stuff, and I've read it, and I've seen it, and I felt it, and I know the companies that they were all part of. It was a rat pack of magnates, money people that just greed got the best of them. They turned that building into the City Trust and Savings Bank, and they rented offices to themselves to various tenants on the upper levels. Then they sold it to some good friends of mine in 1969 to the Birdman brothers for $230,000. The company invested more than $1 million from 1988 to 1993 for mechanical and interior renovations in anticipation of selling the building to Farmore. When the scandal plagued Farmore, Bourbons looked at other options. The other options, of course, what do we do with this? What do we do with this building? So they sold it to the city for pennies on the dollar, and the city sold it. That is part of the money magnet rat pack. Well, there you have it. The real truth about Youngstown. Our founding fathers of Youngstown. There's a lot more to it than that. I just thought I would highlight on some of the events that have taken place. The reality is it's still going on, and I do not want to name anybody at this point or any situations that are going on. But there are Stambaughs out there who are really not allowed into Stambaugh Auditorium. There's not even anybody named Stambaugh running it. I think that's really horrible. I also think that maybe in the future I will come out with some more truths about our founding fathers of Youngstown. If you don't believe any of this, that's okay, because I know the truth. I've seen the truth, and I've talked to ancestors. So, have a good night. Talk to you soon.